He is a true and faithful God. I invite your attention, please, to the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel in chapter number 15 this morning. We'll be spending our time in this chapter and the first 14 verses of the next chapter. And I pray that God will use His word in our lives this morning. If you're able to stand, I invite you to stand for the reading of the scriptures. We're in 2 Samuel chapter number 15. I'm going to begin reading in the first verse, and I'll read down through the 18th verse. It says in verse number 1, "And it came to pass after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early, stood by the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there's no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, Moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any sue or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifice. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David, saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And David said unto all of his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. The king's servant said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 women which were concubines to keep the house. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was far off. And all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Would you pray with me, please? And as we talk to the Lord, would you ask the Lord to use His Word today in your life to bring you face to face with whatever God knows you need and I need. The wonderful thing about God is He doesn't see us as a corporate body. He sees us individually. And today He wants to minister to our hearts through His Word and by His Spirit. Would you ask Him to do that in your heart? Father, I thank You this morning. I thank You for the Bible, the Word of God. I thank You for this historical narrative that we've been able to spend so many months in as we've looked at the life of David, a man after Your own heart. And I pray this morning that You would speak to us once again. Lord, I don't want to just be the preacher this morning. I want to be a listener. I want to be a hearer. I want to be a doer. So speak to my own heart. Help me as I speak, Lord, to speak plainly and clearly. May today You have free course to work in our lives. May we hear You and obey You. In Jesus' name I pray it all. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you for standing. If you've been with us as we're journeying through the life of David, the king of Israel, you know that in 2 Samuel chapter 11, there was a great turn in his life. For in 2 Samuel chapter 11, he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and then in order to cover his sin, he had her husband Uriah killed in battle. And honestly, from that day and that point in David's life until the end of his life, everything was either touched, affected, or happened because of his choices. And the chastisement of David's sin would continue until he finally dies, as is recorded for us in 1 Kings chapter 2. Yet in all of it, I believe that David, a man after God's own heart, even though his fellowship was broken for a while, even though he rebelled undoubtedly in his own spirit against the Spirit of God, when he finally confessed it, and that confession is found in the 51st Psalm, that fellowship was restored. And as David goes forward from that place, he goes forward understanding that what he is enduring is the loving hand of God's discipline. And the wonderful thing about David is he repeatedly acknowledged the goodness of God in his life, even in his chastisement. I want you to leave your Bible marker right there in 2 Samuel 15. It's definitely where we'll spend the bulk of our time. But go with me to the book of Psalms. And would you go with me, please, to the third Psalm, Psalm number 3. Psalm number 3 has a title which very clearly tells us it was written in the time that we're looking at in the life of David. It is titled A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now, there are many other Psalms that I believe David wrote during this period of exile in his life. As a matter of fact, I believe the next Psalm was probably written during this period of his life, but this one he titled so that we know it. What I want you to see is, even in the midst of his discipline and chastisement, David never lost sight that God was at work in his life. Now look at it with me, please. Verse 1, Psalm 3. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. Selah means pause and ponder what he just wrote. Oh, no doubt David understood the surrounding, if you will, of his own soul by his enemies. But notice what he does in verse 3. He takes his eyes off the horizontal and he puts his eyes on the vertical. And he says in verse 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head. I cried unto the Lord with all my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. There's that word Selah again. I laid me down and slept. Even though he's surrounded by enemies, even though he is fleeing for his life, he said, you know what? I got a good night's rest. I waked, verse 5, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God. For thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Selah. Yes, in the midst of experiencing great trial and trouble, David never lost his trust in God. You know, sometimes we get in trials and trouble and we only see ourselves. Or we only see those who are causing the trouble, you know. It's easy when someone is attacking you to only see them. And they look like they're bigger than life itself. But can I assure you this morning, we have a God who is bigger than any enemy. I love the way John put it in the New Testament. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Oh, I understand this morning. It's one thing to see the power of God defeating giants and winning wars, but quite another to see God's power when all are against you and your world is falling apart. See, in all of this, David realized the grace of God. He understood that the Lord had not forsaken him. I said this early on in this study that the difference between David and Saul was not their sin. They were both sinful just like we are. The difference between David and Saul was David was a good repenter. As a matter of fact, if you were to go back, and we will not, but if you were to go back over there to 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 15, you would find God dealing with Saul, but you would not find Saul repenting. And you know what God did because of Saul's refusal to repent? The scriptures record for us that he left him. He forsook him. David feels God's presence very close. It's evident as you read the third division of the Psalms. And he understood that God was still at work in his life as a wounded warrior. Now, I'm sure that if you and I would have inquired of David, he may have said something like this: there's no end in sight. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. You hadn't heard a health and wealth preacher preach that lately, have you, huh? It's amazing how we try to make it sound like you just love God, you'll never have a problem. Right. Somebody should have told David. That's right. He could have sent $25 in and got a prayer cloth and been a lot better off. No, it may not get better. But I'll tell you what, you always have God. Now Absalom. We began looking at Absalom back in chapter 13. We're introduced to him in verse 1. We're going to watch him all the way through the 18th chapter. So we're just in the midst of it. We're not anywhere near the end of it. We saw last week there in the 14th chapter, he was a handsome young man. Verse number 25. We saw he had no character, but that lack of character didn't dissuade those from following him, because he had royal blood in his vein, not only on his father's side, David, but his mother's. Also, her father was the king of Geshur. He was a corrupt man. But the one thing that amazes me about Absalom, he was a patient man. You know, sometimes corruption immediately responds. But you know what? From the time that Amnon raped Absalom's full sister, his half-sister Tamar, till the time that Absalom had Amnon killed was 2 years. When Absalom fled from Israel and went to the land of Geshur, the land of his grandfather, you know how long he stayed there? Chapter 13 tells us he was there 3 full years. From the time that Joab, David's general, persuaded David in chapter 14 to bring Absalom back, you know how long it was before he saw his father's face? It's 2 years. Now, I know we read it in the scripture and we think it happened verse after verse after verse after verse after verse. But do you understand, since the violation of Tamar by Amnon, we're 7 years down the road. Absalom was a shrewd sinner. But he was always working for his own good. He was always using every avenue to mesmerize people and win their allegiance. What a contrast between David and Absalom. What a contrast. David won people's affection and allegiance through service and sacrifice. Absalom won people's affection and allegiance through star status. David was a hero. Absalom was a celebrity. You know, we live in a world where sometimes it's hard to discern that, isn't it? I know you and I have the perspective of hundreds and thousands of years looking back at David and Absalom, and maybe that helps us. But can I just tell you that everybody who does everything in our world doesn't always do it for the motive they seem to be doing it for. They sometimes have an ulterior motive. I want you to see in the text this morning 2 movements as we investigate the thought, no end in sight. First of all, I want you to notice with me the conspiracy. Very clearly, that is said to us in verse number 12, there about the middle of the verse. The sentence reads, "And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom." Absalom was manipulating people to follow him, and seemingly did so unknowingly to some of them of his ultimate plan to be made king himself. It's quite interesting how he started this conspiracy. In chapter 15 and verse 1, he shows up in Jerusalem, look at it, with horses, with chariots, and 50 bodyguards. I'd say he had a pretty good entourage, didn't he? I'd say that people, when they saw Absalom arrive, thought, wow, I wonder who's that. I wonder who's in that limousine. Chariot, I mean. You know, it's easy to get caught up with people's star status, isn't it? And what's really interesting is, Samuel, the prophet, told the people of Israel all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 8 that if they ever got a king, he'd come riding in on horses with chariots. Why? It's all about appearance. Friend, listen to me. Man looketh on the outward appearance. That is so true. But you know what David declared in the 20th Psalm? He said in verse 7, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. See, Absalom's leading this conspiracy in a manipulative manner. As a matter of fact, verses 2, 3, and 4 tell us he went down to the gate of the city. Now, what's the gate of the city? Some of us have had the privilege of going to Israel. Some of us will go later this year. The gate of the city is where official business was done. The gate of the city would be like you and I saying our city hall or our county courthouse or our capital. The gate of the city was where people went and they made their presentations and they would get a judgment. So what does Absalom do? Absalom gets a little bit from the gate of the city, and as everybody comes in, he greets them. Did you notice how he greets them? He says in verse 2, what city are you from? I do that a lot. When I talk to people, I say, where are you from? Not because I'm Absalom, okay, but it's just a good conversation piece. And a lot of times I'll know somebody from that city or that area or know something about that area, and I'll chit-chat about it. I mean, Absalom's being all folksy here. Where are you from? And they'll say, well, we're from Benjamin, or we're from Judah, or we're from Simeon, we're from Asher, we're from, you know. And then he would say to them, you know, you got a good cause here, verse 3. But I hate to tell you this. You know David, the king? He ain't got nobody down here to hear it for you. He said, verse 4, I wish I was a judge. I wish every man could come to me with a lawsuit, and I'd do them right. And then verse 5 says, when they came near then to bow down before him because they realized he's the king's son, he said, oh no, don't do that. Just stand up, let's shake hands and hug each other. We like each other. You do understand that everybody that hugs you doesn't love you. Some of them are fleecing your back pocket. No, I mean, Absalom, man, he's doing everything to win everybody to him. And as a matter of fact, what it says there in the end of verse 6 is really what he wanted to do. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So when he realized that he had enough of a following to lead his rebellion, what did he do? It's very interesting. Verse number 7, he made his way to David to ask permission to go to Hebron. Now, let's just be honest. He didn't have to have David's permission. David had given him permission to go anywhere, do anything. At this time, he could come in and out of the palace. They had seen each other supposedly reconciled, as we talked about in verse 33 last week in chapter 14. What was he doing? He was trying to look innocent. He was trying to persuade folks that everything's going to be okay. And I'll tell you what's sad. What is sad is he used the name of God to get it all done. That's what he said in verse 7. I pray, let me go and pay my vow. He said he'd made a vow to God, which I vowed to the Lord in Hebron. And I vowed a vow when I was in Geshur. If the Lord will bring me again to Jerusalem, then I'll serve the Lord. What a lie. You know, it is so sad to me when people are deceptive, but it is doubly sad to me, maybe triply or quadruply, when people use the name of God to cover up their wrong. You know, I'm just thinking sometimes, and you probably never had this thought, but you just pray for me, okay? I'm thinking sometimes if I was God right now, I'd zap them in front of everybody. I'd make them a French fry. You know, I mean, it'd be over with. It'd be over with. I'm glad God doesn't respond to me like that. I just think He ought to do it to you every once in a while, but not me. You know what I was saying? It's amazing. Here he goes to Hebron, but he is not going to Hebron to worship. He's working out his own plan. You have to think, why Hebron? Well, if you've been with us, Hebron is where David was first, well, he's first anointed king in his father's house in Bethlehem, but anointed before people as a whole with the land of Judah. That was in Hebron. Perhaps Absalom knew there were some people in Hebron who were still mad at David for moving the palace and the capital down to Jerusalem. Hebron was his own birthplace. So he probably thought he had a few kinfolk there who would be charmed by his wowed by his charms. Hebron was a special place in the nation of Israel's history. Hebron was a defense city, a place from which he could easily attack Jerusalem. So what does he do? Verse 10, he sends spies. That's not like people to spy out people. That's like couriers. That's like messengers. And he says, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, you can say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. Carries 200 men, verse 11 says, that don't even realize what he's doing. So easy to get tricked, isn't it? How many, don't raise your hand. If you're like me, you've been tricked many times. I've been fooled so many times. And I think I'm a good reader of people. These 200 people unwittingly follow him to Hebron. But what's interesting is verse 12. He sends for Ahithophel. Who's Ahithophel? Well, he's identified here as David's counselor. If you are been with us going through the story, you know he's a friend of David's. Why Ahithophel? You understand it when you understand Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. He was finding common ground with Ahithophel. We both hate David. I hate him for this reason, you hate him for that reason. You know, hatred makes a lot of comrades. And Ahithophel falls in with David. So David hears it. The conspiracy is revealed to him in verse number 13. These words, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. Now, can I just say this about the statement? I'm not going to deride the statement, but the truth is, it's not fully and completely true. It's kind of like they. You ever had anybody say to you, they said? You would think there were 712 of them. And there wasn't even 2 of them. Well, there was 2 because that's how you could use they legally. You know? They. Both of them. They won't even say it that way. No, don't say both of them. You say they. They said. They. And I don't think they're trying to lie to David. I think that they are just overwhelmed at what is happening and how quickly it is happening. But what does David do? Isn't it interesting? David, the great warrior, we've seen it all the way back from his teenage years against Goliath. David, the great warrior, in order to spare as many lives of innocent people that he can, he doesn't put up a fight. Do you understand there's sometimes when you and I just have to leave something in the hand of God. Well, I'm telling you what, no, Pastor, I'm telling you, I'm going to go get them. David, as quickly as he can. As a matter of fact, notice how he says it there. Arise and let us flee. Make speed, I'm in verse 14, to depart. Though David has not been proactive in the last few years of his life, he immediately sprung into action and no doubt saved many, many, many lives. Why? Because he knew that Absalom was a murderer at heart and he would do whatever he needed to get the throne. His servants, verse 15 says, we're with you. Down in verse number 18, all the Cherethites and the Pelethites, those are his personal bodyguards. All the Gittites, those are Philistines. As a matter of fact, they're identified as 600 men which came after him from Gath. You remember those years he spent in the land of the Philistines when he was a fugitive from Saul. They all rallied to his side. So you see the conspiracy. Secondly, quickly, you see the caravan. Now, what is really interesting, and we will not have the time to dissect all of these places and all of these people. I'll only be able to give them to us in some brief format, and you'll thank me for that at 12:45, okay? I'm trying to see if you're awake. Only 3 of you are, okay? But what is interesting in this caravan, there are 2 things that are primarily given to us. Number 1, it's people, and number 2, it's places. And all of these people and all of these places are really a study in and of themselves. If we had the time and if I wanted to take the next several weeks, I could take us through these people and these places and we could talk about them. But I want you to see them, at least a quick glance at them. All right? The first one is found in verse 19. He's Ittai the Gittite. He's one of those men who followed David from the land of the Philistines. And he's among those 600 men that come after him to go with him. So what does David do? David looks at Ittai, and he says, wherefore goest thou, in verse 19, with us? Return to thy place. Abide with the king. What a humble statement that is. He calls Absalom the king. Wow. Abide with the king. For thou art a stranger, a foreigner, an exile. You're running from the law. Wherefore thou camest but yesterday. And that didn't mean like yesterday. I mean, you've just been here a few years. You weren't born in Israel. Should I just make you go up and down with us? See, I go whither I may. Return thou and take back thy brethren. Take those 600 fellows, and mercy and truth be with you. What's David doing? David's not wanting half-hearted followers. David is understanding that everybody who leaves with him from Jerusalem and makes the trip to where they will ultimately arrive, Mahanaim, he's wanting every one of those people to be real, true blue followers because he has no idea. Remember, there's no end in sight. He doesn't know what's going to transpire tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. He doesn't know how long this will be. He doesn't have any idea of the severity of what they will suffer. And he knows this. Listen to me. He knows that a half-hearted follower is not going to stay. You remember when the people of Israel left the land of Egypt? You remember what one of their problems were? They had some people that got mixed in with them from the Egyptians that saw the hand of God, and they went along for a joyride. But when they got out in the wilderness, they said, man, we like some melons and leeks and garlics back yonder at home. And man, that mixed multitude always caused Israel a problem. So David says, no, Ittai, you stay here. It's okay. You won't be any problem. But notice his response, verse 21. He said, as the Lord liveth, and as my Lord the King liveth, surely in what place my Lord the King shall be, whether in death or life. Isn't it amazing? I mean, he's given full commitment. Whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be. Wow. This is not the last notice, but I want you to see verse 23. And all the country wept with a loud voice. And all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron. And all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. Not only do we see Ittai, we see Kidron. If you were in the city of Jerusalem this morning, you went to the east side, or you stood up on the Temple Mount and looked eastward, you couldn't see Kidron. You could see Olivet. It would be on the other side. But down in the bottom of that valley is Kidron. Kidron is repeatedly used in the scriptures as a place of sorrow, a place of suffering. As a matter of fact, Kidron is where the blood of the sacrifices on the Temple Mount would eventually end up. Times like Passover, they say that literally thousands and thousands of animals were slain, and Kidron would become a blood river. And so David is exiting Jerusalem to the east, and he's weeping. He's weeping. No doubt his heart is heavy because he's leaving Jerusalem behind, and we know through the Psalms how he loved the city of Zion. But I really don't think that's the cause of the greatest part of his weeping. I think he's weeping for Absalom. As a matter of fact, we'll see it later in chapter 18. Great weeping for Absalom. His heart is broken. Why? Why is his heart broken? His heart is broken because Absalom's heart has never been broken. We saw it last week in chapter 14 and verse 32. Absalom passed it off. If there's any iniquity in me, let him judge me. I've not done anything wrong. And I believe David is brokenhearted because his son has never been brokenhearted. This morning, if you have someone in your family or a friend of yours that you know they've never been brokenhearted before the Lord, one of the things that you have is a broken heart for them. How could Absalom, raised up in the home of David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, not have a heart for God? Right. David's brokenhearted. He's broken for Absalom's obstinate heart. Leave a Bible marker there in chapter 15. I want you to go into the Psalms once again. I want you to go to Psalm 61, would you please? Psalm 61. I believe the 61st, the 62nd, and the 63rd Psalms are Psalms written during this exile. Psalm 63 gives some indication that he's in the wilderness in Judah in its title. Listen to David's cry. We're in Psalm 61. Hear my cry, O God. Attend to my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Look at Psalm 62. Truly, my soul waiteth upon God. From him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. How long will you imagine mischief against a man? Ye shall be slain, all of you. As a bowing wall shall ye be, and as a rotting fence. They only consult to cast him down from his excellency. He's talking about himself. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly. My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him. Look at Psalm 63. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory. So as I've seen thee in the sanctuary, I remember seeing you on the holy mount. I remember seeing you in Zion. I want to see it that way again, Lord. I'll tell you what's interesting is how each of these Psalms ends. Go to verse 8. So will I sing praise unto thy name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. Go to verse 12 of Psalm 62. Also unto thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy, for thou renderest to every man according to his work. Look at verse 11 of Psalm 63. But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone that sweareth by him shall glory, but the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. In each of them, he expresses his dependence upon God and his understanding that he himself could not handle what was being done to him, but that God can handle whatever comes our way. Zadok and Abiathar, the two we're introduced to next. Again in verse 24, and the Levites with them, and they have on their shoulders the Ark of the Covenant. As David's marching out, they're marching out with the Ark. You remember the Ark is symbolic of the presence and the power of God. As a matter of fact, Israel has often treated the Ark like some people treat a rabbit's foot. It was like it was some lucky piece that you carried with you. And you remember the trouble they got in because they carried that Ark some places they shouldn't have carried it. David looks at Zadok and Abiathar and says, we don't need the Ark. You understand? David wasn't interested in the furniture of God. He was interested in the favor of God.
That's right. Amen. Yes, sir.
I'm afraid sometimes you and I get caught up in the emblems instead of the very presence of God. I love church. I do. I enjoy coming to church. I'm glad I get to come to church. But you know what? I'm glad the Lord's with me on Monday night at 11:28 too. I don't come here thinking, I hope he shows up today. No, he's already in me. Now, I know David didn't have that same experience. We're talking about a different time period in the scriptures. I understand all that. But you know what? David understood what he needed was God. As a matter of fact, if you read the story, and we don't have the time to go through it. If you read the story, he actually sends Zadok and Abiathar and their two boys back in the city to serve as a spy for him. He knows that Absalom at least has a little respect in his heart for God, and he doesn't think he'll kill the priests and the Levites yet. Now we know Saul did, okay? Saul killed 83 of them at one time. But I think David thinks, so there he's in Israel, the holy mount's there, and surely he wanted them to be his eyes and ears. So the next place we see him is verse 30. Look at it. And David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet. So he's come out of Jerusalem. He's come down the valley, crossed the Kidron, and now he's ascending Olivet. Well, if you know anything about Olivet, you know what's on that side of Olivet? Gethsemane. Now, I can't prove this to you, but I believe that David stopped in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's not said that. All we're told is he was ascending Olivet. Notice how he goes. Look at verse 30. Don't miss this. And wept as he went up, and had his head covered. That's a symbol of shame. Went barefoot. That's a symbol of humility. And all the people that were with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went. Wow. It tells us in verse 32, when he got to the top of the mount, he worshiped. He wept, I believe, in Gethsemane. But when he got to the top, he worshiped. Hey, listen to me. The top of that mount's a precious spot.
That's right. Yes, sir.
Top of that mount's where Jesus would leave from and go back to heaven. The top of that mount, according to Zechariah, is where Jesus one day will step his foot on it and it'll split wide open and he'll walk into the city of Jerusalem. Top of that mount's a holy place. And while he's ascending the side of the mount, verse 31, he's told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And what does David do? David doesn't curse him. David talks to the Lord, shows me over and over again his submissive heart to God. Oh Lord, I pray thee turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. He knew Ahithophel was a great counselor. And it's interesting, I believe he prays that in verse 31, and then in verse 32, God sends the answer to his prayer in the form of Hushai the Archite, who comes to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head, all symbolizing his humility and his brokenness before God. And he says, listen to me, David does, he said, if you go on with me, you really won't be a help to me, but I'll tell you what you could do. You could go back over to Jerusalem, and when Absalom shows up, which he will in verse 37, when he shows up, you can be there to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. You know what? David believed in praying, but he believed in acting too. You know what the book of James says? The book of James says faith without works is dead being alone. David realized there was only some things he could do and only some things that God could do, but David wasn't willing to let God do everything. He was willing to do what he could do. So he sends Hushai. As David and his caravan rolls on, verse 1 of chapter 16 says they topped the hill. And guess what? Ziba. Now, Ziba, if you were with us back in 2 Samuel chapter 9, Ziba was the servant of Saul who became the servant of Mephibosheth, who was the only living son of Saul. And David wanted to do something good for someone in Saul's house, and somebody brought him Ziba and said, well, listen to me, king. He does have one boy. We've kind of kept him hid down in Lodebar, but he does have a boy. His name is Mephibosheth. And David, you remember, extended kindness to Mephibosheth and went down there and brought him up to the king's house and set him at the king's table and gave him the king's garments and let him eat as the king's son. And I mean, it was all good. Here's Ziba. And Ziba meets David. Ziba had been made the manager of the farms and the fortune of Mephibosheth. He got everything that belonged to Saul. And what does Ziba do? Ziba meets him, verse 1, with a bunch of gifts. Got a couple of donkeys there. Got 200 loaves of bread. Got 100 bunches of raisins. Got 100 units of summer fruits and a bottle of wine. And the king says to him in verse 2, what do you mean by this? And he said, well, king, I mean, you need something to ride on, and you got a bunch of folks with you, and you got a hard journey. And he said, well, where's Mephibosheth, thy master's son? I think at that very point, David's a little suspicious of him. And listen to what he says. Listen to it. Verse number 3 in chapter number 16. Behold, he, that's Mephibosheth, abideth at Jerusalem. Of course he does. He's lame. He can't walk. For he said, today shall the house of Israel restore me the kingdom of my father. What a lie. All you have to do is fast forward to chapter 19. We will not go there, but you just jot them down, look at them later. Chapter 19 and verse 26 and 27, when David's back in Jerusalem, he finds Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth said, I told Ziba to get me on a horse and let's go find you. Uh-oh. Be sure your sin will find you out. Now, David rashly, gives Ziba everything belongs to Mephibosheth. Now, when you get to chapter 19, he's going to take half of it back, okay? David gets down. Verse number 5 says to Bahurim. He's met there by Shimei. Boy, I'm telling you, what a scene. What a scene. He gets to Bahurim. Shimei is he's in Benjamin territory. He's in Saul's old territory. Shimei starts throwing rocks at him. He's up on top of a hill and he's cussing him. And David says, all right, boys, off with his head. No. That's what Abishai says. If you read down verse 9, 10, 11, somewhere on there. Who's Abishai? Abishai is the brother of Joab the general. Abishai has been involved in the murder of Abner. Abishai is the one when David found Saul asleep and he was there where he could have killed him. Abishai says, if you ain't going to do it, Dave, I'm going to kill him. And David said, no, we're not going to touch the Lord's anointed. Just cut a little piece of his skirt off and let him know we was here. You say, why didn't David jump on Shimei? He's cussing the king. He's throwing rocks at him. Later in that same, I think it's about verse 12, says he's throwing dust up in the air. Any way he can to humiliate David. But I want you to see this, and we're almost through. David didn't resist Shimei. Why? Because he knows some of what Shimei was doing was truth, saying was truth, and he knew what he was doing was the working of God. That's right. Look at verse 10, okay? We're in chapter 16. And the king said, what have I to do with thee, with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord hath said unto him, curse David. What shall then say? Who shall then say, wherefore hast thou done so? Verse 11, David said to Abishai, to all his servants, behold, my son, which came forth out of my bowels, seeketh my life. Absalom's trying to kill me. How much more now may this Benjamite, this Shimei, do it? Let him alone. Let him curse. For the Lord hath bidden him. Look at verse 12. Now, what an attitude. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. There's no retaliation. There's no getting even. And Shimei didn't quit. Verse 13, he keeps cussing him and throwing stones at him. Casting up the dirt. Why would David not get him? Because David is a man after God's own heart. And he's understanding that what he's receiving in chastisement he deserves. Now that's a hard lesson to learn, friend. It's a lot easier for me to read it in David's life than it is me living my life. Because if you get me, I'm going to get you. How about Jesus? When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When they cursed him, he didn't speak evil to them. And so our text this morning closes in the 14th verse with this statement. I want you to see it and we're through. And the king and all the people that were with him came weary and refreshed themselves there. Now, we're not told where there is. I believe there is the bank of the Jordan. And I think David was refreshed. Not just because it was an oasis in a wilderness. Not just because there was clear spring-like water. I think David was refreshed at the bank of the Jordan because he thought back to the day when Joshua led the priests to step in the water and the water parted hither and thither. And the people of God passed over the Jordan on dry ground. I think David was refreshed because he knew, thou art a shield to me. Thou art the lifter of my head. Thou will never leave me, forsake me. I'm in your care. Do you know this morning, every one of us can live in the care of God? I'll tell you what's quite interesting to me. As I close the message, the similarities between David and Jesus. David was rejected by his own people. John 1:10, he came into his own, it says about Jesus, and his own received him not. David was betrayed by a familiar friend, Ahithophel. So was Jesus by Judas. David gave up everything in Jerusalem to save as many people as possible. He who was rich became poor for our sakes, that we through his poverty might be made rich. David crossed Kidron and prayed near Gethsemane. So did Jesus. Not my will, but thine be done. David was falsely accused and shamefully treated by Shimei, but submitted to the Father's will. Jesus suffered the shame of the mocking and the trial and the scourging and the crucifying. All because he was submitted to the Father's will. Do you know Jesus today? He knows you're here. He knows you're listening. He wants you to know him personally. If you do know him today, can I ask you another question? Are you living submitted to the Father's will? Pastor, you don't know how bad I got it. I would think you would at least agree somewhat David had it pretty tough. But he kept submitted. And you know what? Just when he needed it, God brought him to the bank of the Jordan, and he was refreshed there. I'm glad that wherever I'm at, God knows. And if I'll stay submitted, he'll bring me to the place of refreshment. Amen. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed.